Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we're continuing our look at setting up your Synology NAS right the very first time. In this second part of our series, we're going to be looking at user account control, user account creation, installing applications, and creating shared areas of storage for you, family members, team members, and more. Now again, this is utilizing DSM 7.2, and this video going out right now is part 2. So I strongly recommend, if you're setting your NAS up for the first time, that you look at part 1 of this series where we set up our storage, our RAID area, and ultimately have the system prepped moving forward. But let's carry on. So the first thing you're going to need to do is to look into user account creation and control. At the bottom of the screen, you're going to see chapters if you're more interested in other areas of this setup. But the reason we're starting with user account creation is later on we're going to be assigning a certain degree of control and access to individual users. And if your Synology NAS is going to be accessed either automatically by different devices for backup, synchronization, or even streaming multimedia, it's important that different levels of access is provided to those individual services. So we need to go into the control panel, and from here go into user and group. In user and group, you will see a few tabs. There at the top is the account I created as a kind of control user on this system that has pretty much all of the access rights that we're going to need on a day-to-day basis on a system control level. Down here we have a guest account, which is disabled by default, and there at the bottom, or in the middle I should say, is the super user, the admin account, which ultimately has full power. I would not enable that account unless you really need to do system maintenance and troubleshooting. But to create a new user, as you might expect, select create. From here, give this user a name. Now for me, I'm going to call this person Alan. This account here, we can add an email address, give them a description. We also have to give them a password. Now, it's worth highlighting this user Alan. I'm going to use them as an example of someone who I want to be able to access the NAS, back up data to certain locations, but not give them too much power. So from there, we can see if we've given them an email, we can send a notification, click next. From here, we're going to see groups that we can assign them to. And as you can see, there's our default admin group, there's our group for just web services, and there's another one as a default. We're going to leave it as default because default has the lowest level of access to the broader system requirements. In a moment, I'll also show you how to create a brand new group. So if you're a business user, for example, and you want these users to have access to sales data, these warehouse users to have access to logistics data, HR to have access to corporate and personnel data, and so on and so on, you'll be able to do that with different user groups. Click next, and from there we can see right now we've not assigned any shared folders. We'll be doing that later on, but we'll be coming back to this tab later. Next up, user quota, what they can access in terms of storage. And finally, if there are different applications on the NAS, you can choose which one of those applications they're allowed to use. So for example, I would like them to have access to file management, but I don't want them to have access to rsync or the ability to access any of our backups, or have access to fully fledged areas of file transmission on the system. You can scale that quite accordingly. Next up, you can choose the performance limits, because if you're concerned that you may have 10, 20, 100 users all accessing the system at once, you may wish to assign performance limitations to individual users who have got lower priorities. The last thing you want is a user who has relatively no importance to the broader system clogging up your network bandwidth. And you can assign that to those different apps and services. Once you're done, click done, and we've created that user. Now we're not just going to create that user Alan. I'm going to go ahead and create a second user, and I'm going to call this user Plex. Now again, we'll be coming back to that in a moment, but we have to once again give them the same level. We'll put them in that default admin group. We're going to give them that password. We're going to move forward. Again, we're going to repeat every single step that we just created for the user Alan, but later on we'll be coming back to that secondary account. So as you can see, it's that straightforward to create individual users. Now, what about groups? Because once again, you may want to put users into paddocks. And remember, the majority of the steps in today's video can be done in any order. but I'm showing them in this way, in ways that will become clear later. But choose the order of these in the way that best suits your needs. We create a new group. We'll call this group Sales. Again, we can give it a description if we choose. From there, that group, much like with the individual users, can be assigned granularly. So, for example, we're going to make sure that Alan is in our sales group. From the sales group, we've still not created those areas of shared storage. More on that later. And again, the steps are largely the same, but this way you've got an overarching section of rules which will override an individual user. From there, there's our restrictions, there's our limitations, and we've created that new group for sales that's got our individual user. Now, before we go further, it is worth highlighting that in the event that you need to give one of those temporary or low access users more power, you can delegate that power on the fly. What do I mean by that? If we select user Alan, if, for example, his PC requires more access and there's a system admin where his system is located, what you can do as an admin is delegate administration powers. So you can either, one, see what they actually have access to, or more importantly, choose temporarily to give them a certain amount of super user access. And again, you can really granularly break down just what kind of super user access they have. And you can even have that temporarily as well. Now we've created our users, we've created our user groups. The next thing we want to do is create our areas of storage. Now the areas of storage on the system, if we go into File Station here, you'll see no shared folders have been created. Now a shared folder is, as the name suggests, a folder that is shared. Traditional bog standard files and folders on the system are in their own way, much like using a Windows File Explorer or a Mac Finder, just the same breadcrumb breakdown of files and folders. A shared folder takes that logic, but the main directory, the base level folder, can now be accessible outside of the system user interface. So, for example, we click OK, then we start creating our shared folder. So we're going to call this shared folder Media. This shared folder, we choose a volume that we put it on, and if you'd followed my previous video, you'll know that we talked through how to create individual volumes, be they hard drive or M.2 NVMe, but you say where this shared folder is going to live within those containers known as volumes. From there, decide whether you want to hide this from the local area network. Also choose whether you want to give this folder a recycle bin so you can recover data within 30 days of deletion. And then from there, click Next. Now the next step here is a little bit more specific to Synology. Number one, you can choose to encrypt this shared folder, which will ensure that the data being transferred in and out of it is garbled or encrypted. That will potentially lower some of that performance, but you have that option. But the really interesting addition that Synology have rolled in recently is Write Once, or Write Once, Read Many, or WORM. This allows a user, once the data is inside this bucket, to have a certain period where it can never ever be deleted. So as you can see, for example, here we have two modes. Enterprise mode, which allows the data in that folder to not be deletable by anyone apart from a system admin. Alternatively, compliance mode will ensure that no one, not even a system admin, can delete or modify that data. Now, why would you do that? Because maybe for legal reasons, you need that data to be maintained, or that data is genuinely irreplaceable. Example, the photos of your child growing up. Once those photos are gone, you can hardly buy them again. So this allows you to be protected from things such as ransomware, which may try to zip up, encrypt, and ransom note you into getting your key to release your data. But just bear in mind that this is a double-edged sword. If this data can't be deleted, that is an area of storage in your system that you're never going to be able to use again. So be aware what you are doing, and if you are in doubt, go with Enterprise Mode to, at the very least, an admin account can modify or delete that data. You can even allow an auto lock time period where the folder is subject to change for a certain period of time, and that period of time is quite adaptable, but that will allow you to have a shared folder that you can put data in, take data out, delete, modify for a certain period of time before write once read many locks up that folder. And again, depending on the importance of your data, that may be appealing. The same goes for retention, where in the retention policies you can choose for how long that data can never be amended. So you can say, for example, we need to hold on to this data for legal reasons for 3 to 5 years. You can choose to do that, but then after that period you can then delete it when it has passed, or just choose that it can be locked forever. You can even modify if you want that data to be never changeable, or the data can be added but never removed or modified. It's a very flexible system, and it's one that Synology rolled out DSM 7.2, which has been very popular indeed. Choose if either of those options are applicable to you, or skip them, but bear in mind you cannot retroactively apply these. They have to be created and implemented at the creation of the shared folder. The next up, you can choose if you want to have integrity checks to take place on that shared folder periodically for the data inside. You can also choose if you want to have a certain limit to the amount of scale that this shared folder can grow towards. All of that adaptable, but they have to be adapted at the beginning. Some options can be modified later on, but the most important ones cannot. And as you can see, we've now created our new shared folder. And once again, the reason we created the users and groups earlier is this allows us to start assigning access. So as you can see, now we can see that the admin user has got read and write access there, as is my created super user. But Alan here, we can actually decide, do we want Alan to have access to this data? So in my case, I'm going to say that he's got read-only access. That means he can see and use the data, but he cannot modify it or delete it in any way. The same goes for the Plex account. The Plex user account I've just created, I can choose that that user can either have read-only access or read and write access. Because as you may be able to anticipate for later on in this series, I'll be using that account for a Plex Media Server Synology NAS setup. And if you're going to be scraping metadata, if you're going to be adding to the pile of data, then you may wish to give read and write access to those directories moving forward. So now we've created our write once folder there, which is a media folder, allowing us to share this data appropriately, which is going to be quite handy for us there. Next up, let's talk about what we can do with this folder. So one of the most obvious things, and one of the things that a lot of beginner Synology NAS users will do in order to allow them to natively access the Synology NAS using their Windows or Mac system, they may wish to map the network drive. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, when we go to the average computer, a PC or a Mac system, you may be wanting to use the NAS for storage, but you want to use your own file explorer. You want to use your own native file explorer. But as you see here, I've got my local SSD, which is the SSD inside this laptop, but I can't see the NAS. One of the ways in which you can do this to add the Synology NAS in a block fashion to your Synology NAS, to your local PC, is to go back to the Synology Assistant tool that we installed in part 1 of this series, select the NAS on the local area network you already created, then select the option Map Drive. Or you can go ahead and right click and select the option Map Drive there. From here, you need to enter the user credentials that you want to use to access the NAS and add it to your local system. That's why we created the user account earlier for Alan, because then we can now map this drive to user Alan and his computer, but not give him too much access. So for example, we enter the user details we created earlier, we click next, and then it will display the available shared folders in the system. Now, depending on your operating system, a new window will appear to show you how to map the network drive. On a Mac system, you'll probably go straight through within the Synology Assistant program to map the drive. But in the case of Windows, you will often see the Network Manager listing all of the available mappable network drives. And once you've got that screen in front of you, give the drive a letter. In this case, I'm going to give it the letter S for Synology. And then you can see the directory there. You've already added your login credentials into this, and you can click Finish. And then from there, as you can see, click back, we've now added the Synology NAS to our local PC via our local folder here. So if we go back into the Synology NAS, what we can do is start adding files and folders. There's different ways to add that data. So for example, if I go ahead and select those files, I can just drag them into that media folder within the Synology NAS window there, click overwrite, and that data will now be added. Alternatively, you can just select the upload option, select upload skip if you don't want the same data to be written twice, or overwrite if the same file arrives twice, and then from there go ahead and once again select a bunch of images, click open, and it will upload the data to the NAS via that last window. Finally, if you have mapped that network drive as we've just discussed, because as you can see there, all the data has appeared, you can go ahead, if you choose, to grab some other data, copy it, and within your native file explorer, so not even using the Synology NAS, go ahead and add the data there. You still will need to make sure you've got the permissions from the user account you're using. So in this case, Alan only has read-only access. But if you're using an account that has write access, it will allow you to add that data. This is just an example of how read-only will allow you to be able to share that data with users and then allow them to actually see the data that's inside the folder, but simultaneously not allow them to add or modify that data in any way, which is going to be really useful for the integrity of your data when sharing it across lots of users. Now, there are lots of other ways to share the data on your NAS in a more efficient, effective, and tailorable fashion to your own needs, and we're going to be covering that in part 3. The reason I bring that up now is we're going to end this video just by briefly showing you how to install applications and services and just a few considerations to bear in mind. So, for example, some apps and services exist in the background of your system, and they're there just to really tweak and improve the system on a minor level. So for example, if you're going to be utilizing PDFs and viewing PDFs on the Synology NAS, go ahead and click install, and what that will do is install this application as a usable tool in the background in the larger sense of using the system. The same goes if you're going to be utilizing their own Office package known as Synology Office, which allows you to take advantage of word processing applications for documents, for PDFs, for PowerPoint presentations, PPTX, Excel documents, and more. And again, you can install those at a single click, and some of them, as you can see, will then require you to add some of those background applications in order to get them running. We will talk about this in another video where we'll go through the key important applications in the Synology App Center for you to install. But the reason we've gone ahead and installed some of these applications already, and I'm going to go ahead and install one in the background to make a point of this, let's go for cloud synchronization there, is because sometimes, much like the access to files and folders that we granted to our user Alan, the same goes for certain apps and services on our client systems. So for example, and later on we'll cover this in a later part in our series, perhaps you want to utilize Plex Media Server on your Synology NAS. And when you use that, you're going to want to give access to your mobile phone devices, to your smart TV, and more, and allow those apps and services access to the NAS. And much like our user Alan, you don't want to give them too much access. So that's why during our user account creation, we created that user known as Plex, because now we've created a dedicated pathway for user Plex where that app can only be utilized by Plex if we choose to, and vice versa. What do I mean by that? Well, when we go to the permissions for this user, and we'll go in and edit this user, we go to applications. Now, as you see, any app that we've installed throughout that time, we grant that user access. So for example, if you're going to be running backup applications such as Hyper Backup, such as utilizing USB backup or more, those different applications, if you wish, you can create individual user accounts that are dedicated to that utility. A great example would be for photography. If you're going to be utilizing your Synology NAS and want to use their AI-powered photo recognition, and you're going to be backing up from lots of mobile devices and lots of desktop devices, you may wish to create a specific user for photography that you can install on all of those photo sending devices, those devices that your photos are on, to automatically upload, and also make sure that that app and service on those devices doesn't have too much power, doesn't have too much access to other apps and features within your Synology NAS, which could inadvertently cause damage down the line if those are exploited negatively. And finally, as mentioned in our previous video, if you're going to create multiple user access points into your system, it's highly recommended that you make sure that you don't just rely on the strength of a password and a username. You can go ahead and add lots of different means to monitor user accounts and add security provisions. So for example, you can find out account activity and find out how and when they're being accessed by the system. You can even kill them off remotely if you choose to. Equally, you can go ahead and add passwordless access by installing the Synology Secure Sign-In application for mobile phone, and that allows you to ensure that those users that are accessing the system are utilizing a recreating 30-second key, much like two-factor authentication and OTP, that ensures that a simple password isn't enough. The same goes for two-factor authentication if you want to use third-party OTP tools like Google Authenticator. Finally, if you make your way into the control panel, you can even add very, very detailed account security protection that ensures that certain IPs can't be accessed, heighten the level of base level security if a new system connects that you've not heard of before. And that's not even getting into if you want to go ahead and access external connectivity using a Synology account. But that draws to a close part 2 in our series of setting up your Synology NAS right the first time. User account control, creation, application control and installation, and creating shared areas of storage as well as accessing them in the most efficient way possible. In the next part in this series, we're going to be zooming in on the subject of synchronization and backups, probably one of the most important ways and reasons a number of you go for a Synology NAS, and we're going to be going through the different methods and how they work to back up your Synology NAS, either backing up the content of your Synology NAS to a USB, cloud or other NAS system, as well as using synchronization and backup tools on your local PC or Windows system to back up onto the NAS, as well as reference to mobile tools. So I look forward to joining you again in part 3. And once again, don't forget that if you do need more assistance, you can use the free advice section over on NAS Compares, as well as our NAS Builder to build your perfect NAS system to your needs, to know which one you should go for, as well as using that free advice section, going to some of our recommended third-party support and first-party support areas, or if the 3 to 5 day working day response on our free advice section isn't good enough, use expedited support via Ko-Fi and Patreon, our Ask.NAS Compares forum, or go over to our services tab where you can get expedited support or one-to-one Zoom consultation with myself or Eddie at NAS Compares. And don't forget our membership tier for access to these videos earlier, as well as priority voting on future content, our monthly Zooms, and more. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on part 3.